Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you're listening to Nature and the Nation. This podcast uses the format of a book review to explore the intersection of philosophical naturalism with paleoconservatism within the framework of the revitalization of the Republican Party. We will be exploring politics, philosophy, psychology, economics, and sociology through a wide variety of books published both recently and historically. Thank you for tuning in. So, for today's episode, we will be looking at Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. This book was published in 2011, and it was written by Daniel Kahneman, who is the winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics. He was recognized along with his partner, Amos Tversky, and the two of them researched decision-making and loss aversion and risk-taking and many other things. And ultimately, the work that they did together created, to some extent, the foundations of behavioral economics. And so they're both very important figures. Amos Tversky passed away in 1996, but the author of this book, Daniel Kahneman, is still alive, and they're both great assets to the fields of economics and psychology. And some of the information in this book about decision making is really important to those fields, and will be important to us, and is important to politics and an understanding of the way humans behave, which is really kind of the information that we're after here. This book will provide a lot of insights in that field. Now, back in The Selfish Gene, we had talked about hawks and doves and how it was an evolutionarily stable strategy to have a certain ratio of hawks and doves, and I had said that it was also feasible for there to be a stable ratio of hawk and dove behavior, which might be embodied by each entity in the simulation, so that any entity that deviated from this particular proportion would find itself at a disadvantage. And that was sort of introducing the idea that you can have kind of a variety of behavioral strategies within any individual that you would use at different times. Sometimes you would behave this way, sometimes you would behave that way, and it would be a kind of a stable relationship with the environment to behave in certain ways at certain times. And the more specific you could be in responding to the environment, in other words, the more information that an entity would have about the environment, such as the history of other entities with which it is interacting, or how much resources could be gained from doing this or doing that, this sort of balance of behaviors could become evolutionarily stable. And that's largely what this book is about in its own way, although he doesn't use the evolutionary terminology really in this book. He's talking about a balance of behaviors that we use to make our way in the world. And these two different behavioral modes he refers to, well, that's the what's in the title here, Thinking Fast and Slow. There's fast thinking and slow thinking. He refers to them in the book as System 1 and System 2. And these have been referred to differently by different people. It's been referred to as the elephant and the rider, the elephant being System 1 and the rider being System 2. I sometimes think of System 1 as the lizard brain. It's the fast thinker. And it evaluates the environment very quickly. It throws out responses very quickly. It is intuitive, and it doesn't use a lot of your mental resources the way that System 2 does, or the rider. This is the calculative function of the brain, and this is very resource dependent. It's tiring, and we tend to use the calculative function, the System 2 function, I guess as little as possible in a way. Although we obviously have objectives, and we employ System 2 quite a bit to make our way in the world. We do delegate a lot of activity to System 1. And we'll get into that more in this book, the way these kind of the lizard brain and the calculative brain the interaction between these fast and slow thinkers. And the first section here that I want to read to you, as always, I'm going to read to you a number of sections from this book and comment on them. I'm actually going to read a large number of sections from this book, more than normal. I've got 10 sections set aside that I want to read. Some of them are very short, though, so it shouldn't bog down to be too long of an episode. But there's a lot of stuff in here that I want to comment on. It's a pretty long book. It's like 420 pages plus quite a bit of appendix, and it's just packed with information. So I'm going to read some sections and I'm going to leave other significant sections out entirely, but I recommend you pick up the book to get into all of the details. I'm going to leave out some of the more economics-based stuff, and there's just, I wish I could go over all of it. There's so much in this book that's so useful, so I would put it on my list of highly recommended books for understanding the human mind. So the first thing that I want to talk about here is the concept of association. And this is one of the tasks of System 1 of the lizard brain, the associative function. So here he says, quote, "To begin your exploration of the surprising workings of System 1, listen to the following words: bananas, vomit. A lot happened to you during the last second or two. You experienced some unpleasant images and memories. Your face twisted slightly in an expression of disgust. Your heart rate increased, the hair on your arms rose a little, and your sweat glands were activated. In short, you responded to the disgusting word with an attenuated version of how you would react to the actual event. All of this was completely automatic, beyond your control. There was no particular reason to do so, but your mind automatically assumed a temporal sequence and a causal connection between the words bananas and vomit, forming a sketchy scenario in which bananas caused the sickness. As a result, you are experiencing a temporary aversion to bananas. Don't worry, it will pass. The state of your memory has changed in other ways. You are now unusually ready to recognize and respond to objects and concepts associated with vomit, such as sick, stink, or nausea, and words associated with bananas, such as yellow and fruit and perhaps apple and berries. Vomiting normally occurs in specific contexts, such as hangovers and indigestion. You would also be unusually ready to recognize words associated with other causes of the same unfortunate outcome. Furthermore, your System 1 noticed the fact that the juxtaposition of the two words is uncommon. You probably never encountered it before. You experienced mild surprise. This complex constellation of responses occurred quickly, automatically, and effortlessly. You did not will it, and you could not stop it. It was an operation of System 1. The events that took place as a result of your hearing the words happened by a process called associative activation. Ideas that have been evoked trigger many other ideas in a spreading cascade of activity in your brain. The essential feature of this complex set of mental events is its coherence. Each element is connected, and each supports and strengthens the others. The word evokes memories, which evoke emotions, which in turn evoke facial expressions and other reactions, such as a general tensing up and an avoidance tendency. The facial expression and the avoidance motion intensify the feelings to which they are linked, and the feelings in turn reinforce compatible ideas. All this happens quickly and all at once, yielding a self-reinforcing pattern of cognitive, emotional, and physical responses that is both diverse and integrated. It has been called associatively coherent. In a second or so, you accomplished automatically and unconsciously a remarkable feat. Starting from a completely unexpected event, your System 1 made as much sense as possible of the situation. Two simple words, oddly juxtaposed. By linking the words in a causal story, it evaluated the possible threat, mild to moderate, and created a context for future developments by preparing you for events that had just become more likely. It also created a context for the current event by evaluating how surprising it was. you ended up as informed about the past and as prepared for the future as you could be. An odd feature of what happened is that your System 1 treated the mere conjunction of two words as representations of reality. Your body reacted in an attenuated replica of a reaction to the real thing, and the emotional response and physical recoil were part of the interpretation of the event. As cognitive scientists have emphasized in recent years, cognition is embodied. You think with your body, not only with your brain. End quote. So that's a really interesting section. Basically, he's saying that your System 1 brain function will take things that are unrelated, but maybe juxtaposed, or maybe have some sort of association with each other, or even just being presented to you, that you respond to things really rapidly, like your response to the word vomit was automatic. You didn't even think about it. Just mild revulsion, maybe not even conscious, just measurable by, say, the dilation or the contraction of your pupils. And your sweat, the amount of sweat that you release, and your pulse and things, just very mild unconscious reactions to things like that, and these sort of automatic, very subtle connections between bananas and vomit, or between different things that get put forward as ideas that are could potentially be related to each other. You almost put together narratives or stories that one thing caused another thing, or you think about different ways that this or that might be related, and you kind of run through a few of the potential mechanisms by which things are related with each other. And when you seize on one, you just kind of throw it out there mentally into your conscious mind. Your consciousness becomes aware of these connections that your System 1 puts out there. And you use this to make your way in the world. And he actually talks a little bit about how useful it was. He said, starting from a completely unexpected event, your System 1 made as much sense as possible of the situation. Created a context for future developments by preparing you for events that had just become more likely. Created a context for the current event. You ended up as informed about the past and as prepared for the future as you could be. This is a function of your brain that helps you survive in the world, and it's not a necessarily rational function. I mean, even the words, they're not intended to be causative, that the bananas came before the vomit, which is kind of like this presumable sequence that the left to right, I suppose, you kind of like draw these conjunctions of what comes first and what comes later. But your brain puts together stories that aren't obvious, or are maybe only implied, in order to build a narrative and to make everything kind of associatively coherent, is the word that he uses, so that you're seeking to make everything make sense. Your System 1 is just trying to take these data that you receive of being in the world, right? Especially when you think about the scenarios in which people evolved these mental systems of being in the world and seeing things and automatically creating causal stories and narratives that help people survive in the wild in which we evolved. So there's that. Then the other section I wanted to mention is related to that very closely, and that is that of priming. So in this section, he says, quote, "As is common in science, the first big breakthrough in our understanding of the mechanism of association was an improvement in a method of measurement. Until a few decades ago, the only way to study associations was to ask many people questions such as, what is the first word that comes to your mind when you hear the word day? The researchers tallied the frequency of responses such as night, sunny, or long. In the 1980s, psychologists discovered that exposure to a word causes immediate and measurable changes in the ease with which many related words can be evoked. If you have recently seen or heard the word eat, you are temporarily more likely to complete the word fragment S-O blank P as soup than as soap. The opposite would happen, of course, if you had just seen wash. We call this a priming effect and say that the idea of eat primes the idea of soup, and that wash primes soap. priming effects take many forms. If the idea of eat is currently on your mind, whether or not you are conscious of it, you will be quicker than usual to recognize the word soup when it is spoken in a whisper or presented in a blurry font. And of course, you are primed not only for the idea of soup, but also for a multitude of food-related ideas, including fork, hungry, fat, diet, and cookie. If for your most recent meal you sat at a wobbly restaurant table, you will be primed for wobbly as well. Furthermore, the primed ideas have some ability to prime other ideas, although more weakly. Like ripples on a pond, activation spreads through a small part of the vast network of associated ideas. The mapping of these ripples is now one of the most exciting pursuits in psychological research. Another major advance in our understanding of memory was the discovery that priming is not restricted to concepts and words. You cannot know this from conscious experience, of course, but you must accept the alien idea that your actions and your emotions can be primed by events of which you are not even aware. In an experiment that became an instant classic, the psychologist John Bargh and his collaborators asked students at New York University, most aged 18 to 22, to assemble 4-word sentences from a set of 5 words. For example, finds he, it, yellow instantly. For one group of students, half the scrambled sentences contained words associated with the elderly, such as Florida, forgetful, bald, gray, or wrinkle. When they had completed the task, the young participants were sent out to do another experiment in an office down the hall. Their short walk was what the experiment was about. The researchers unobtrusively measured the time it took people to get from one end of the corridor to the other. As Bargh had predicted, the young people who had fashioned a sentence from words with an elderly theme walked down the hallway significantly more slowly than the others. The Florida effect involves 2 stages of priming. First, the set of words primes the thoughts of old age, though the word old is never mentioned. Second, these thoughts prime a behavior, walking slowly, which is associated with old age. All this happens without any awareness. When they were questioned afterward, none of the students reported noticing that the words had had a common theme, and they all insisted that nothing they did after the first experiment could have been influenced by the words they had encountered. The idea of old age had not come to their conscious awareness, but their actions had changed nevertheless. This remarkable priming phenomenon, the influencing of an action by the idea, is known as the eidometer effect. Although you were surely not aware of it, listening to this podcast primed you as well. If you had needed to stand up to get a glass of water, you would have been slightly slower than usual to rise from your chair, unless you happen to dislike the elderly, in which case research suggests that you might have been slightly faster than usual. The eidometer link also works in reverse. A study conducted in a German university was the mirror effect of the early experiment that Bargh and his colleagues had carried out in New York. Students were asked to walk around a room for 5 minutes at a rate of 30 steps per minute, which was about 1/3 their normal pace. After this brief experience, the participants were much quicker to recognize words related to old age, such as forgetful, old, and lonely. Reciprocal priming effects tend to produce a coherent reaction. If you were primed to think of old age, you would tend to act old, and acting old would reinforce the thought of old age, end quote. So that is a really interesting section there. And that's an important concept, that of priming, that you draw these associations, you get a concept in your mind and you're thinking about it, whether it's old age or bananas or whatever. You've got some concept in your mind, and as you go through your life in the immediate vicinity or immediately afterwards or whatever, you will be primed for certain concepts, and you will be more able to recognize them when they're spoken. You'll be more able to recognize them written somewhere, or if you see a banana, you'll be more likely to notice the banana than you would be if you hadn't heard the podcast mention that, or other things that you become more conscious of and you become aware of them. But it's not just in the conscious sense that, I become more aware of these bananas than I ordinarily would. It's that, you become more aware of yellow things. You become more aware of things that are in any way related to the idea that you've been primed for. So it's like an anticipation of other events in the world that will match up with that for which you are already primed. So you're looking for, you're seeking these associations, and even drawing these conclusions where they might not even exist, in order to create this sort of cohesion, the associative coherence that we had talked about. So you're trying to limit the amount of effort that your system 2 has to do to figure out what's going on, because it uses resources. So your system 1's like, no, I'll take care of it. Well, here are these automatic associations, and as long as you can continue to operate upon them, you'll do well. And so it's sort of like feeding your system 2 information, like, hey, be on the lookout for this or be on the lookout for that. It might be important. And that's kind of the priming effect. It's just this permanence that happens in your mind. Not permanence, but it's like through time, you become aware of something in the time frame immediately after you've been exposed to this thing. So moving on from there, I want to read this section about the mental shotgun. This is a very short section that I want to read from this, just to kind of introduce the concept. He says, quote, "System 1 carries out many computations at any one time. Some of these are routine assessments that go on continuously. Whenever your eyes are open, your brain computes a three-dimensional representation of what is in your field of vision, complete with the shape of objects, their position in space, and their identity. No intention is needed to trigger this operation or the continuous monitoring for violated expectations. In contrast to these routine assessments, other computations are undertaken only when needed. You do not maintain a continuous evaluation of how happy or wealthy you are, and even if you are a political addict, you do not continuously assess the president's prospects. The occasional judgments are voluntary. They occur only when you intend them to do so. You do not automatically count the number of syllables of every word you hear, but you can do it if you so choose. However, the control over intended computations is far from precise. We often compute much more than we want or need. I call this excess computation the mental shotgun. It is impossible to aim at a single point with a shotgun because it shoots pellets that scatter, and it seems almost equally difficult for System 1 not to do more than System 2 charges it to do." End quote. So this is basically this mental shotgun where your System 1, your lizard brain, is computing things constantly, even when System 2 does the calculative function, doesn't ask it to, draw forth its opinion on this or that other thing, that it's just offering voluntarily anything that it thinks might be potentially related to something that's going on. So it's draws all kinds of secondary conclusions, and this has to do with things like the halo effect. Like if somebody's good at one thing, well, he's probably good at all these other things, and you draw this kind of impression of what sort of person it is, even if it goes way beyond what System 2 has asked System 1 to analyze, essentially. That mental shotgun of just excessive judgments about everything that you experience. So I want to move on from there to the heuristic. The heuristic is basically sort of a rule of thumb, and these rules of thumb are generated by System 1 with obviously input from System 2. They're not generated exclusively from System 1, but they're sort of rules of thumb. I'm not going to read a long section here, but just to mention it and throw forth his definition. He says, quote, "If a satisfactory answer to a hard question is not found quickly, System 1 will find a related question that is easier and will answer it. I call the operation of answering one question in place of another substitution. I also adopt the following terms. The target question is the assessment you intended to produce. The heuristic question is the simpler question that you answer instead." The technical definition of heuristic is a simple procedure that helps find adequate, though often imperfect, answers to difficult questions. The word comes from the same root as eureka, End quote. So that's just a simple definition of heuristics. It's a simple procedure that helps find an adequate, though often imperfect, answers to difficult questions. This is sort of like the approximation that I talked about way back in pragmatism, that you operate in life through a sort of constant approximations of reality in order to give you adequate information about things. And much of that is drawn on various heuristics, mental rules of thumb, or simple rules that help the system one to provide simple, quick, resource-efficient answers to questions for which an exact answer could only be arrived at through a more laborious calculative process. It's sort of a substitution. Well, I'll answer the question of what is my general opinion about this person, because that's a quick, easy question I can answer with my system 1 versus, a really involved system 2 calculative question of whether or not a person is trustworthy or not, that system 2 might not even have the capacity to answer, but system 1 will throw out the answer based on something that might not be particularly related, sort of a substitution of a quick heuristic answer to a complicated question. So that's the basics of what a heuristic is, and then he talks a lot about the different heuristics that we operate by. I'm going to mention some of them, but I'm certainly not going to mention all of them. But there are a lot of them, and they're very interesting and very revealing. So at this point, I want to get to anchoring. Anchoring is very similar to priming, but it's more like an evaluative concept. Well, let me read this and I'll try to see if I can pinpoint the difference between the anchoring and the priming. He says, quote, "Amos and I once rigged a wheel of fortune. It was marked from 0 to 100, but we had built it so that it would only stop at 10 or 65. We recruited students of the University of Oregon as participants in our experiment. One of us would stand in front of a small group, spin the wheel, and ask them to write down the number on which the wheel stopped, which, of course, was either 10 or 65. We then asked them 2 questions. First question, is the percentage of African nations among UN members larger or smaller than the number you just wrote? Second question, what is your best guess of the percentage of African nations in the UN? The spin of a wheel of fortune, even one that is not rigged, cannot possibly yield useful information about anything, and the participants in our experiment should simply have ignored it. But they did not ignore it. The average estimates of those who saw 10 and 65 were 25% and 45% respectively. The phenomena we were studying is so common and so important in the everyday world that you should know its name. It is an anchoring effect. It occurs when people consider a particular value for an unknown quantity before estimating that quantity. What happens is one of the most reliable and robust results of experimental psychology. The estimates stay close to the number that people considered, hence the image of an anchor. If you are asked whether Gandhi was more than 114 years old when he died, you will end up with a much higher estimate of his age at death than you would if the anchoring question referred to death at 35. If you consider how much you should pay for a house, you will be influenced by the asking price. The same house will appear more valuable if its listing price is high than if it is low, even if you are determined to resist the influence of this number, and so on. The list of anchoring effects is endless. Any number that you are asked to consider as a possible solution to an estimation problem will induce an anchoring effect. End quote. So basically what he's talking about here is how, as if you're presented a number or a concept, but in this anchoring, he's talking specifically about numbers. If you're presented with a number before you're asked to estimate some value, the value that you estimate is going to trend toward the number that you were just presented, even if the number comes from the spinning of a random wheel of fortune, or what is understood to be a completely random number generated by a wheel of fortune. That number will still influence your idea of what the correct number should be when you're asked to make an evaluation. That's really interesting, and he talks about it in economic terms as well, like in the asking of a house, whether you're going to think, is this more or less, worth more or less than what number I've been presented? You're always going to trend toward the number that you've been presented. So laying out that default value, having the capacity to lay out the default value and have kind of control over the anchoring numbers and the anchoring concepts that our society works by is really a powerful thing, As far as the difference between that and priming, I think it's really very similar. I guess anchoring would be a numerical form of priming, but it's useful in pointing out how. Because it gets into behavioral economics, and it talks about how people don't use rational analysis. Like, that's really what anchoring comes down to, is that if you make an estimate of a number, you're trying to do some kind of analysis of some sort, and you're just inherently influenced by this unrelated number that you cognitively know is unrelated, then you can't be considered to be a perfectly rational entity. It works as an argument against the rationality of economic actors that kind of dismisses some of standard economic theory. So anyway, moving on from there, he talks about availability, and this is really how quickly you can come up with examples of things. So he says, quote, "One of our projects was the study of what we called the availability heuristic. We thought of that heuristic when we asked ourselves what people actually do when they wish to estimate the frequency of a category, such as people who divorce after the age of 60, or dangerous plants. The answer was straightforward. Instances of the class will be retrieved from memory, and if retrieval is easy and fluent, the category will be judged to be large. We defined the availability heuristic as the process of judging frequency by the ease with which instances come to mind. The statement seemed clear when we formulated it, but the concept of availability has been refined since then. The two-system approach had not yet been developed when we studied availability, and we did not attempt to determine whether this heuristic is a deliberate problem-solving strategy or an automatic operation. We now know that both systems are involved." And then he goes on to say, quote, "The availability heuristic, like other heuristics of judgment, substitutes one question for another. You wish to estimate the size of a category or the frequency of an event, but you report an impression of the ease with which instances come to mind. Substitution of questions inevitably produces systematic errors. You can discover how the heuristic leads to biases by following a simple procedure. List factors other than frequency that make it easy to come up with instances. Each factor in your list will be a potential source of bias. Here are some examples. A salient event that attracts your attention will be easily retrieved from memory. Divorces among Hollywood celebrities and sex scandals among politicians attract much attention, and instances will come easily to mind. You're therefore likely to exaggerate the frequency of both Hollywood divorces and political sex scandals. A dramatic event temporarily increases the availability of its category. A plane crash that attracts media coverage will temporarily alter your feelings about the safety of flying. Accidents are on your mind for a while after you see a car burning on the side of the road, and the world is, for a while, a more dangerous place. Personal experiences, pictures, and vivid examples are more available than incidents that happen to others, or mere words or statistics. a judicial error that affects you, will undermine your faith in the justice system more than a similar incident you read about in a newspaper. Resisting this large collection of potential availability biases is possible but tiresome. You must make the effort to reconsider your impressions and intuitions by asking such questions as, is our belief that thefts by teenagers are a major problem due to a few recent instances in our neighborhood? Or could it be that I feel no need to get a flu shot because none of my acquaintances got the flu last year? Maintaining one's vigilance against biases is a chore, but the chance to avoid a costly mistake is sometimes worth the effort. End quote. So basically this availability heuristic is the idea that if something comes easily to mind, then you imagine that it is more frequent, or the number of, or the size of the class, like the number of different examples of whatever it is, of the example that you're able to call quickly to mind, this pool of examples is larger. It happens more frequently, things like that. So this availability heuristic, it enhances threats and opportunities if you can easily call a threat of this nature or an opportunity of this nature to mind. And so that changes our sense of loss aversion, and it changes our tendency to take risks based on the media and based on our acquaintances and the people that we know and associate with. Our assessment of the world is going to be slightly off because of this overinflation of frequency and of size of class based on this heuristic. And also, there are all sorts of interesting implications of this availability heuristic. I'm going to mention briefly the availability cascade. He says, quote, "An availability cascade is a self-sustaining chain of events, which may start from media reports of a relatively minor event and lead up to a public panic and large-scale government action. On some occasions, a media story about a risk catches the attention of a segment of the public, which becomes aroused and worried. The emotional reaction becomes a story in itself, prompting additional coverage in the media, which in turn produces greater concern and involvement. The cycle is sometimes sped along deliberately by availability entrepreneurs, individuals or organizations who work to ensure a continuous flow of worrying news. The danger is increasingly exaggerated as the media compete for attention-grabbing headlines. Scientists and others who try to dampen the increasing flow and revulsion attract little attention, most of it hostile. Anyone who claims that the danger is overstated is suspected of association with a heinous cover-up. The issue becomes politically important because it is on everyone's mind, and the response of the political system is guided by the intensity of public sentiment. The availability cascade has now reset priorities. Other risks and other ways that resources could be applied for the public good all have faded into the background." End quote. So that availability cascade is basically like the idea that something happens and the media boosts it, and different entities that, if it bleeds, it leads. They make this thing into seem to be a bigger thing than it is because of the. I mean, it's let's think about if a dog bites a man, it's not news, but if a man bites a dog, that's news. That kind of idea that if it's unusual, that makes it news, right? But people look to the news for an understanding of the way reality is and the way reality works, and they're going to use this availability heuristic to think that those sorts of things which are reported on in the news happen more frequently than they do, because the news is not giving you an even spread of, every time a dog bites a man, there's a story, and every time a man bites a dog, there's a story, and so we get an accurate understanding of the frequency of the one category of activity or the other category of activity. The news doesn't work like that, and so it may not be lying when it says that a man bit a dog. It is distorting if you're going to approach the news as if it's some sort of even-keeled representation of reality. No such thing exists. They're driven by motives, and they have the necessity of limiting the amount of information that they can share in any in any case, which makes that whole availability cascade a common occurrence, because then the politicians have to respond to all of the people that are making a big stink about this particular issue or that particular issue that's driven by the media or driven just by circumstances. So that's a pretty interesting concept there, that availability cascade. There's not too much more that I want to cover in this book. I feel like I've gone through those sections pretty quickly. None of these are really long sections that I want to read. I just want to cover some of these topics because there are so many topics in this book, and so many that I have chosen not to cover, but are all really interesting. So I do want to mention loss aversion, and this gets a little bit more into the economics of it, but he talks quite a bit about loss aversion. This is a pretty important concept. I just want to mention it a little bit. I don't want to get into a tremendous amount of detail in this on this section. He says, quote, "Many of the options we face in life are mixed. There is a risk of loss and an opportunity for gain, and we must decide whether to accept the gamble or reject it. Investors who evaluate a startup, lawyers who wonder whether to file a lawsuit, wartime generals who consider an offensive, and politicians who must decide whether to run for office all face the possibilities of victory or defeat. For an elementary example of a mixed prospect, examine your reactions to the next question. You are offered a gamble on the toss of a coin. If the coin shows tails, you lose $100. If the coin shows heads, you win $150. Is this gamble attractive? Would you accept it? To make this choice, you must balance the psychological benefit of getting $150 against the psychological cost of losing $100. How do you feel about it? Although the expected value of the gamble is obviously positive because you stand to gain more than you can lose, you probably dislike it. Most people do. The rejection of this gamble is an act of System 2, but the critical inputs are emotional responses that are generated by System 1. For most people, the fear of losing $100 is more intense than the hope of gaining $150. We concluded from many such observation that losses loom larger than gains and that people are loss averse. You can measure the extent of your aversion to losses by asking yourself a question. What is the smallest gain that I need to balance an equal chance to lose $100? For many people, the answer is about $200, twice as much as the loss. The loss aversion ratio has been estimated in several experiments and is usually in the range of 1.5 to 2.5. This is an average, of course. Some people are much more loss averse than others. Professional risk takers in the financial markets are more tolerant of losses, probably because they do not respond emotionally to every fluctuation. When participants in an experiment were instructed to think like a trader, they became less loss averse, and their emotional reaction to losses, measured by a physiological index of emotional arousal, was sharply reduced. End quote. So that's the basics of loss aversion. Like if you're gonna play a game of let's flip a coin, if it comes up heads, I give you $150. If it comes up tails, you give me $100. This sort of, personally, I'm not sure that I would take that, even though I know the expected value, the expected return of such a thing would be a net positive. I don't know if I would do it because a 50% chance to lose $100, it's not, I don't know if it's worth it to me to do that, something like that. And that's the same result that they found with people, that how much would you have to offer somebody to win on a heads for it to be worthwhile? And the average result was about $200. So if you say, okay, heads, you get $200, tails, you lose $100, at that point, maybe, okay, the chance to win $200 is pretty good. Like if you were to say to me, heads you get 1,000, tails you lose 100. At that point, I would be like, yeah, sure, I'll take that deal. I'll take that, because the payoff is good enough. And so they kind of try to find what that number is where people will say, on average, will say, yeah, I'll take it. And that came out to be $200. So the idea here is that it's not just in these sort of games like this, but in everything that we do, we tend to be loss averse. So if you are if I'm going to buy a used book on Amazon, for example, how much would I be willing to pay for it? And then there's some designated number depending on the book. Maybe it's $20, okay? And then you say, okay, now how much would I be willing to part with this book for? Say someone offered me $20 for the book. I would probably say no, and maybe it's because I went through the process of acquiring it, but in general, I'm much more averse to losing something that I already own. You'd have to pay me more for any given thing that I own versus the amount of money that I would be willing to pay to acquire it. Because I'm kind of loss averse. I like to have things. Something I have becomes instantly more valuable to me. I don't like to lose things. So a loss is more valuable to us. It has more loss of utility than the win. An equivalent would provide us with a gain of utility. And that dichotomy, that difference between our perception of the loss and gain of an equal amount of money, the marginal of for a business to gain an extra $1 in profit or to lose $1 in profit, they wouldn't value that evenly because a business composed of people is loss averse, and they're not going to look at that from a rational perspective and say to lose $1 or to gain $1 should have an equal, it should be, the positive and the negative evaluation of that should be equal, but it's not, because we're not neutrally, rational creatures. We're all a little bit loss averse. And that's really interesting. It has a lot of economic implications, has political implications as well. And I'm going to mention those a little bit in this following section here when he talks about the status quo. He says, quote, "If you are set to look for it, the asymmetric intensity of the motives to avoid losses and to achieve gains shows up almost everywhere. It is an ever-present feature of negotiations, especially of renegotiations of an existing contract, the typical situation in labor negotiations and in international discussions of trade or arms limitations. The existing terms define reference points, and a proposed change in any aspect of the agreement is inevitably viewed as a concession that one side makes to the other. Loss aversion creates an asymmetry that makes agreements difficult to reach. The concessions you make to me are my gains, but they are your losses. They cause you much more pain than they give me pleasure. Inevitably, you will place a higher value on them than I do. The same is true, of course, of the very painful concessions you demand from me, which you do not appear to value sufficiently. Negotiations over a shrinking pie are especially difficult because they require an allocation of losses. People tend to be much more easygoing when they bargain over an expanding pie." Many of the messages that negotiators exchange in the course of bargaining are attempts to communicate a reference point and provide an anchor to the other side. The messages are not always sincere. Negotiators often pretend intense attachment to some good, perhaps missiles of a particular type, in bargaining over arms reductions, although they actually view that good as a bargaining chip and intend ultimately to give it away in an exchange. Because negotiators are influenced by a norm of reciprocity, a concession that is presented as painful calls for an equally painful and perhaps equally inauthentic concession from the other side. Animals, including people, fight harder to prevent losses than to achieve gains. In the world of territorial animals, this principle explains the success of defenders. A biologist observed that when a territory holder is challenged by a rival, the owner almost always wins the contest, usually within a matter of seconds. In human affairs, the same simple rule explains much of what happens when institutions attempt to reform themselves in reorganizations and restructuring of companies, and in efforts to rationalize a bureaucracy, simplify the tax code, or reduce medical costs. As initially conceived, plans for reform almost always produce many winners and some losers, while achieving an overall improvement. If the affected parties have any political influence, however, potential losers will be more active and determined than potential winners. The outcome will be biased in their favor and inevitably more expensive and less effective than initially planned. Reforms commonly include grandfather clauses that protect current stakeholders. For example, when the existing workforce is reduced by attrition rather than by dismissals, or when cuts in salaries and benefits apply only to future workers. Loss aversion is a powerful conservative force that favors minimal changes from the status quo in the lives of both institutions and individuals. This conservatism helps keep us stable in our neighborhood, our marriage, and our job. It is the gravitational force that holds our lives together near the reference point." End quote. So that very last section there, he says, this conservatism helps keep us stable in our neighborhood, our marriage, and our job. It is the gravitational force that holds our lives together near the reference point. That sense of anchoring and priming and loss aversion, they all work to hold social institutions and social norms in place. We don't want things to change because any change could be considered a loss to some individual or another who is going to value that loss more, and it causes us to hold on to the status quo rather than change things very rapidly because we're more concerned with what we may lose versus what we may win. And this is something that we have deliberately. This is something that this is not a potential source of bias that must be driven out of our decision-making process, which is sometimes how people can approach this sort of irrational decision-making and influences on our behavior, but it's something that we've evolved because it has been successful, because it has been beneficial to us in the evolutionary process. It has been an evolutionarily stable strategy to have these sorts of System 1 evaluations and this sort of loss aversion, intuitive tendencies. These are things that help us, and that's why we have them. So there's a lot to think about there. There's a lot of stuff I didn't cover, but some of the stuff that I did cover is going to continue to play a role in our future discussions of human behavior and evolutionary theory. This System 1, System 2, lizard brain versus calculative brain, as I like to call them, or the rider and the elephant, as it has been called. But the System 1, System 2 dichotomy between fast thinking and slow thinking that guides our behavior is an important understanding of who we are and how we behave in the world. So I'm going to wrap it all up now. Thank you for tuning in today, and I hope you come back for our next episode. Thanks a lot. Bye.